Hello, everybody. This is Royce Eddings, and you're watching, and I want to thank you for watching the Royce in the House YouTube channel. Tonight, we're going to be talking about the Lost Jam Session, the story of Black Sabbath and Led Zeppelin's legendary Lost Jam Session. Okay, in the 1970s, rock bands didn't get any bigger than Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath. But the rivalry between the two bands was outweighed by the fact that they had a long-standing friendship, one that peaked with one of history's greatest lost jam sessions. So we're going to do a little background on both bands, and then we're going to talk about the lost jam session and what took place. Okay. So Black Sabbath's background. Black Sabbath's story begins in Birmingham, England. Sabbath, a heavy metal band formed in Birmingham in 1968 by guitarist Tommy Iommi, drummer Bill Ward, bassist Geezer Butler, and vocalist Ozzy Osbourne, the Ozman. Osbourne, Butler, Iommi, and Ward were schoolmates. They all went to school together and were friends in Birmingham, England. And they were looking for a way to not spend their lives working in a factory, but through music, do something different. So they started forming the band, the Polka Tulk, the Blues Polka Tulk, which they later switched the name to Earth. Okay, following a mix-up with another band called Earth, the band changed their name to Black Sabbath, which was a title track on their first album, which was taken from a Boris Karloff movie. Okay, so anyway, and with the years, within 2 years, they were flying off to the United States to play before an ever-growing fan base. Um, Over 70 million records, several lineup changes. Iommi has been the only constant presence, and one headless bad, I might add. Later, they were often cited as the pioneers of heavy metal. Uh, they helped define the genre and release, you know, albums such as, Black Sabbath 1970, Paranoid 1970, and Masters of Reality in 1971. And you know what? While we're here on that subject, I'm just going to show their first album, Black Sabbath. This was Black Sabbath's first ever album that they released, and this one happens to be the debut album that founded heavy metal's 50th anniversary. The debut album that founded heavy metal 50th anniversary includes the legendary cuts Black Sabbath, NIB, and The Wizard. Okay, so this was their first. One I also mentioned was, Black Sabbath Paranoid. And this is I believe, original pressing of Black Sabbath Paranoid. And here's the guys. Okay, so I thought I'd show those since we just mentioned a few of the albums. All right, so, okay, let's move on now. And what we're going to talk about next is Led Zeppelin's background. Okay, so that covered a little bit of Black Sabbath background. I mean, we could do 10 shows on Black Sabbath, but just touching base before we get into the jam session. Okay, Led Zeppelin's background, initially called the Yardbirds. Led Zeppelin was formed in 1968 by Jimmy Page. He was the final lead guitarist playing with the Yardbirds. They were a fantastic and legendary British band, the Yardbirds. Very heavy band. They had three of the greatest guitar players of all time in them. Page was with them when they finally ended, and Jeff Beck was with them at the same time, but he'd left already. So Page and Jeff Beck both played for the Yardbirds. Prior to that, Eric Clapton was the lead guitar for the Yardbirds. Okay, so here's what happened. So the band broke up, the Yardbirds, and Page was anxious to get back on the road and start touring again. Well, when the band broke up, they were under contract to play a bunch of concert dates in Scandinavia. So Jimmy Page got the idea he's going to put a band back together and go fulfill those concert dates. Okay. And so first person he called. Now keep in mind, Jimmy Page was already a famous guitarist, legendary guitarist in England. Everybody knew Jimmy Page, session guitarist extraordinaire. I mean, there, of all the studios in England, one in particular, 60% of the work that left that studio had tracks by Jimmy Page on them. And that's what a session guitarist does. He's called in to enhance someone else's music, songs, albums, whatever. So he was a fantastic guitar player. So he called John Paul Jones, a friend of his, who was also a session bass player. Fantastic bass player. Same thing. He was called in to add tracks to a lot of other people's bands. Who's he was so superior to so many of the bass players in those bands. They wanted to enhance their albums. So John Paul Jones was called in to do that. So Jimmy Page started out by calling his friend John Paul Jones and told him what he had in mind, putting together a band, taken off on tour. And John Paul Jones says, I'm in. So now they had to find a singer and a drummer. So the first person Page asked was Terry Reid, famous vocalist in England, and a very bluesy voice. I've listened to some Terry Reid music, and he was really good. But I tell you what, he was no Robert Plant. Robert Plant is in a class all by himself. So Terry Reid said, "No, I've got other things I'm working on, guys. Why don't you go? Why don't you go take a listen to Robert Plant? He's a really good singer. He might fit in perfectly." So Jimmy Page and John Paul Jones went and found Robert Plant in his basement singing, and they loved what they heard, and they offered Robert Plant the job. And Plant says, "Let me think about it." So he got back with him and he said, "Yes, but we really need to take my drummer along." And that drummer was none other than John Bonham. So John Bonham and Robert Plant were tight early on. Okay, so the band got together and they left to do the Scandinavian tours. And they branded themselves. Well, we'll go a little further first. Okay, so they're in their the studio and they're practicing, and their friends, their mates from the Who, John Entwistle and Keith Moon stopped by just to see how they were doing. And what transpired, they started kidding around, and in either John Entwistle or Keith Moon said, "Well, this ought to go down like a Led Zeppelin." And then one of them said, "Well, this will go down by a lead balloon." And they kept kidding back and forth: Led Zeppelin, lead balloon, Led Zeppelin, lead balloon. And I mean, to this day, they, well, of course, Keith Moon has passed, but forever they debated who was the first to say Led Zeppelin. I think that's kind of a funny story on its own. So they took off and did their Scandinavian tour. They had branded themselves the New Yardbirds. Okay, the New Yardbirds. Here's Jimmy Page, Robert Plant down here in the corner. It says 1969 Live Rarities, and here's the guys here. And this is a great album. I feel very fortunate to have found this. And the songs on it, recorded April 26th, 1969. Communications Breakdown, I Can't Quit You, Killing Floor. Side 2, Fresh Garbage Medley, including That's All Right, Dazed and Confused, and White Summer, Black Mountain Side. Okay, and these extreme rare concerts were recorded live at Winterland and London's Playhouse Theatre for the BBC. Special thanks to Big L. Okay, so that's it. So they branded themselves the New Yardbirds and took off on tour. Okay, as soon as they got back, Jimmy Page called the manager, and well, actually, Jimmy Page called what became their manager, Peter Grant, and told him what they were doing and wanted to know if he wanted to be their manager. And he said, absolutely. Okay, so Jimmy Page, having been already successful as a guitarist and successful in the Yardbirds, which were a big band, had saved money. He didn't want to be at the mercy of the record labels. So Jimmy personally paid for all the recording time, all the studio time. And they went into the studio and spent a total of 30 to 35 minutes recording Led Zeppelin 1. And I think part of that can be explained. Uh, well, first of all, they're fantastic musicians, but also I just read the track list. Several of those songs wound up on Led Zeppelin 1, which made it a little bit easier. They'd been on tour playing a lot of those songs. But anyway, not to diminish their greatness. So they got back, and so it was time to go find a record label. They got everything on tape. They're ready to have the albums cut, but they need a record label. So Peter Grant told Jimmy, "Come on, their new manager. Let's go to Atlantic Records in New York. Let's fly to New York, and if that doesn't work out, we'll check a few other spots." So they got to Atlantic. They went inside, and they were here to see if they could contract to be on Atlantic's record label, and the founder of Atlantic Records, Ahmet Ertegun. Of course, he knew who these guys were. The word came down to him that they were here at their building, and they were looking for a record label. And as soon as he heard that, he let everybody know, sign them. We're their label, because he knew greatness. He knew they were going to be great. Okay, so they were signed to Atlantic. They released their first album, Led Zeppelin 1, in 1969. And before the year was over, they released Led Zeppelin 2. And of course, Led Zeppelin 2 had the single that was released, Whole Lotta Love. And at that point, Led Zeppelin completely blew up. And I got to tell you, I was in high school. I lived this in real time. And I can't think of two bands that I was more excited about than Led Zeppelin. And within a year, Black Sabbath's first one came out, self-titled album. And I loved both those bands. Sadly, I never got to see Led Zeppelin. Who was expecting it to end as quickly as it did? But I did see Black Sabbath twice. Late 1971, 72, Las Vegas Convention Center. I saw Black Sabbath right after they'd made their first two albums. And then later, 1974, at the California Jam at the Ontario Speedway in Ontario, California, I got to see them again at the California Jam, along with an amazing lineup. Deep Purple was there, the Eagles were there, and on and on. Even Linda Lovelace made a guest appearance, flew in a helicopter. Anyway, so that was fun. I got to see them twice. So, okay, so let's get into this a little bit more. So Peter Grant, the manager, record label Atlantic for Black Sabbath. Okay, let's move on now. The story starts out, Ozzy Osbourne walks into a bar. Actually, it was a club. Okay, so Ozzy Osbourne, Tony Iommi look back at the legendary studio jam session with Led Zeppelin. Okay, the lost jam session. The greatest session you've never heard. Led Zeppelin's Robert Plant, Black Sabbath's Tony Iommi were on stage. Robert Plant, Black Sabbath's Tony Iommi, they jammed together in the 70s. Okay, they were all from Birmingham. We knew Robert Plant and John Bonham. This is Ozzy talking. We knew Robert Plant and John Bonham back in the 70s. We had checked Robert out with his early bands, and he told us he was joining the Yardbirds, which in fact he did. The new Yardbirds, formed by Jimmy Page. Okay, and so one day Ozzy and the band were out and about, and they walked into a club in London called Blazes, and the DJ started playing this song. So Ozzy goes up and he says, "What's the name of the band that's playing?" And she goes, "It's the Yardbirds." And she goes, "That's fucking Robert Plant singing. He's a big shot in Birmingham." And she goes, "It's the Yardbirds. They've just changed their name to Led Zeppelin." I was like, and Ozzy was like, "Fuck me." So Sabbath even jammed with Led Zeppelin drummer John Bonham during the early days, and they were playing clubs. John would sometimes come along. He always wanted to sit in and play some, so he'd want to sit in and jam with them. And Black Sabbath guitarist Tony Iommi, the first time we said okay, And he got up, he played Bill Ward's drum set and just wrecked the drums. Okay. Bill was really pissed off. And after that, anytime John came along and said, can I have a go? Bill would say, no. And he never let him play again. But it wasn't until Black Sabbath was making their 1975 album Sabotage that the two bands finally got together in the studio. Okay, we were recording in the Morgan Studios in London, and John came down to see us, says Iommi. He brought Planty and John Paul Jones. Planty, I love it, right? Rock gods having pet names for one another. Planty. Brought Planty and John Paul Jones. Jimmy Page was the only one who wasn't there. They came in, and John's going, let's play Supernaut, John Paul Jones. Let's play Supernaut, because he loved that song. So he sat behind the kit, and we started to play it. Of course, he didn't play it right, but we just carried on and went into a jam. Okay, so it's getting pretty heavy right now. Carried on, went into a jam. Okay, so Ozzy Osbourne, 1975, says, Led Zeppelin had ulterior motives for showing up at our studio that day because they were trying to coax us over to join their label, with Plant mainly looking on. Bonham was the chief architect of the jam. Thankfully, Bill Ward's drum kit remained intact this time. We were just jamming, making stuff up, says Iommi. Our session went totally out the window. So according to Ozzy Osbourne, Zeppelin had an ulterior motive, as I just mentioned. They were trying to get bands to sign up to their Swan Song record label, says Ozzy. They signed up Bad Company, so John Paul Jones came to the studio to try to coax us over as well. But we just been through a fucking war with our manager, so we told them to fuck off. during the same day of the jam session, right? Well, Iommi says that the jam was recorded. The legendary Led Sabbath, or is it Black Zeppelin session, has sadly been lost to history. Okay, so the tapes are probably somewhere, but I don't know where, says Iommi, and it ruined our session anyway. So that's the story of the lost jam session between Black Sabbath and Led Zeppelin. Or was it Led Sabbath and Black Zeppelin? I don't know. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed it. Feel free to visit Royce in the House YouTube channel. There's 242 videos there. My flagship is the live podcast. That's where this video will be found. There's well over 100 music-based videos on that one, like this one. And we appreciate you all stopping by. If you like what you see there, go ahead and subscribe and hit that notification bell so you won't miss another show. And you know what? Subscribing doesn't cost 1 red cent, but it does help my show grow. It gives me a little incentive to keep going. I hope this entertains you guys. And so thank you very much for watching. You're much appreciated, each and every one of you. Everybody's welcome to watch any of the videos they want. Doesn't cost a thing. Subscribing doesn't cost a thing. So anyway, thank you all very, very much. And that's what's going on in Royce's world today. Thank you all so much for joining.